Hello, dear friends. We are again at the book reading project What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind by Norman Fischer and Susan Moon, read chapter by chapter. It's a bit odd to discover that maybe I have forgotten to read chapter 7, which is named Teachings. I cannot really imagine that. I have searched and searched for it actually, but I cannot find it, and my webmaster said he can also not find it, and we do not want to have an incomplete playlist, so I commit here and now to eventually to read it again. Who cares? Better even. As Norman says always, serious religious practice consists actually of repetition, to which I really fully consent. So we might perhaps often listen to the chapters, to single ones or to the whole book, and of course as awake, as present, as curious as possible. So to listen, there is also a vast difference, don't you think? Different to the other chapters, I will not start with meditation. With sitting practice, I have not the time, and I really want to put this chapter in the place where it belongs. So if you find you would like to drop into your body and close your eyes for a while, so I encourage you to do this. It's far better actually. Always really, but sometimes we cannot do it, and this is now the case for me. So let us start. Teachings. Susan Moon is asking, is Zen a religion or is it a secular way of life? Norman Fischer answers, it's a religion. Like all religions, it has a clergy, ritual, scriptures, observances, precepts, and an ecclesiastical history. But, as I've said in answering many of your other questions, people can practice Zen in any way they want to. Your practice is up to you, and you may want to practice Zen in a secular way. If by secular way of life you mean a normal, informal American way of life that allows you to wear whatever you want, think the way you want, go to the movies, watch TV, surf the web, have a wide variety of friends from various backgrounds, drink a glass of wine now and then, and so on, without having to restrict your way of life or thinking or pay enormous dues to your church, then almost all American Zen practitioners are secular in that sense. They are not restricted in lifestyle or belief system. Susan Moon asks, is it important to study Zen literature, or can you practice Zen just by meditating? Norman Fischer. This depends on your goals or intentions for your practice. For almost everyone, practice starts with sitting. The word Zen means meditation, so the practice always starts here. If you go to a Zen place, they'll show you right away how to sit. They won't hand you a scripture to read or a handout about basic beliefs and doctrines. They'll just tell you to sit and see what happens. If you attend a day-long sitting or a Saturday or a Sunday morning event, probably you will hear a Dharma talk, which will refer to Zen or Buddhist teachings. So from the start, you'll be getting some orientation about how to sit and about how sitting relates to the teaching. Probably that input is important. But you don't need to read books and delve deeply into Zen thought. In some Zen places, they'll encourage you not to do that. They'll tell you it will be counterproductive, which may be true, although most people who come to a Zen place will probably have read some about Zen or Buddhism and likely come in the first place because they enjoy and feel they benefit from the reading. In any case, after a while you may be curious to learn more about Zen and Buddhism. And if at this point, in brackets, having been doing the sitting for a while, having listened to a certain number of talks over time, you read a Zen or Buddhist book, you may well find it fascinating, because it now will seem to be articulating things you have already been feeling or seeing in your living, without having a language to conceptualize them. So study will become interesting to you, as if it were biographical, not theoretical. For someone who decides to make Zen practice a more serious pursuit, study becomes important and even more interesting. Your interest in the ins and outs of the teachings become personal and essential for your life. And especially if, as a senior member of a community, you are given the role of guiding people in the practice, then it will seem even more important for you to study and know something about the teachings and even a bit of history. Classical Zen appears to be almost anti-intellectual. One of its most important founders, the legendary sixth ancestor, Huineng, is said to have been illiterate. This hagiographical touch emphasizes that Zen is about dynamic spiritual experience, not scripture knowledge. And many typical Chinese stories involve scholars who throw away their books when they finally see, personally, the truth that Zen proposes to show them. There are experts on Zen teachings, and I appreciate their expertise and often draw on it. But a seasoned Zen person doesn't need to be an expert on Zen teachings. Still, I do feel that a basic intellectual grounding in Zen and Buddhism is important for any serious practitioner. We all have minds that are full of thoughts and theories, mostly unconscious, unexamined, and deeply conditioned. Studying Zen teachings is a way of challenging and examining those thoughts and theories and bringing them into line with one's actual experiences of the practice on the cushion and in living. Susan. What about the teachings of the Buddha that came before Zen? Which are most important for a Zen practitioner to study? The basic Buddhist teachings or the traditional texts of Zen from China and Japan? Norman. Years ago, a few colleagues and I were tasked with creating a study curriculum for the San Francisco Zen Center. We consulted many people and thought about it for a long time and ultimately came up with a program that included all of Buddhism. Early Buddhist teachings, Mahayana sutras, Zen texts, of course especially Dogen, and the classical koan collections as well as some texts from Indo-Tibetan Buddhism that seemed important. As I've said, Western Buddhism is unprecedented in that it includes all the world's Buddhisms in one place and one time all rubbing shoulders together. So all Buddhist traditions in the West are essential hybridized, which is a good thing. It means that it isn't enough to study only one tradition, divorced from other traditions. All Buddhisms refers back to the original Pali texts, or their equivalent in Chinese and Tibetan, so you need that. And all traditions in the West now, even the Theravada tradition, which doesn't recognize Mahayana sutras as canonical, are influenced by and need to know about these sutras too. In our everyday Zen curriculum, we have made a selection from the whole of Buddhism. A doable selection, I think, of basic Buddhist, Zen and Tibetan Buddhist teachings that it seems serious students should have some exposure in. Our website, www.everydayzen.org, publishes the curriculum with my audio or written commentaries on all the texts we study and links to the texts themselves. But even those of us who have studied more, most recognize that our knowledge of Buddhist thought isn't very deep. In Asian countries, the Buddhist canon is enormous, including large numbers of primary and secondary texts, most of which haven't been translated into English. So whole traditions of understanding and thinking about Buddhism remains unknown to those working only in English. And typically, most Western practitioners come to Buddhism as adults, so it inevitably remains, in a sense, culturally exotic for us. This is both good and bad. Bad in that we may be ignorant of some important, even basic issues. Good because we might have a fresh and lively response, seeing things invisible to those more acculturated in the tradition. Let's hope though. Susan. What are the most important Zen texts to study? There are so many. Norman. Yes, there are. For Soto Zen, I'd start with Dogen's Shobogenzo, Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and then study the Koan collections, the Blue Cliff Record, the Book of Serenity, and the Gateless Barrier, all of which have been translated into English with traditional and, in some cases, contemporary commentaries. Then there are a few records of seminal teachers that have been translated, like the Sixth Ancestor Sutra of Huineng, whom I just mentioned, the records of Tung Shan and of Chao Shu, and a few others. The Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra are essential texts on the teachings of emptiness, and there are by now several very good translations of them with commentaries. There are also important texts by contemporary teachers. For us, Suzuki Roshi's books Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and Not Always So are basic. Charlotte Yoko Beck's Everyday Zen is also a classic. Susan. What are the most important teachings? Norman. This is a hard question because it's hard to reduce any religious tradition to a few key teachings. It is a little like asking, tell me the most important things about your life. What can you say? But it's great that you ask, because even though any answer is going to be reductive and misleading, we do have to be able to say something simple about our life or our spirituality. It isn't enough to say too complicated or too mysterious. Even though both these things may be true, it isn't enough because we are human beings who need to communicate with one another and are responsible to one another to do so. And even though the communication may be misleading, it will be the beginning of a conversation. The most important teaching for me and for Soto Zen, especially those lineages of Soto Zen that follow Dogen closely as ours, is Dogen's teaching of continuous practice and, its associated teaching that practice and enlightenment are one. This means that we are not practicing to get enlightenment, to enter a special state we do not now inhabit, but rather to express the enlightenment that is already there as our human birthright. And so we appreciate and see the depth in the practice that we do every day. And practice is continuous in that there is really nothing else but practice. All our daily activities practice that goes on, even past our own lifespan. Next in importance, I suppose, is the teaching of suchness, or such this. A lot of the koans refer to this teaching, which means more or less that just being fully and immediately, a word that literally means without mediation of intellect, concept, prejudice, and so on, present with this moment of your life, present with this moment of your life is the whole of the teachings and the whole point of all we do in practice. To recognize that there is nothing but this one precious moment, and that it includes past and future and the whole of reality. You inevitably wax metaphysical when you talk about this, but in practice you feel it somehow, though as soon as you think you have felt it and begin to describe it and take credit for it, you have lost track of it. Thirdly, as I've gotten older and practiced with more and more people over the years, I've attached much more importance to the teachings about compassion and connection. In Zen, these teachings run deep. They are saying more than be nice, be kind, be decent. They are saying that if you really see your life as it is, you'll see that it's nothing but connection, compassion, and love. That's all there really is. The rest is mostly confusion and conceptual overlay. To be kind is more than a positive character trait that one ought to develop. It's the natural consequence of a full and profound engagement with life. In Zen especially, the teachings are expressed through dialogue and encounter, person to person. The teaching arises between us in this moment. It isn't something that abides in my mind as an idea or a feeling. It's here now, dynamically between us. So my life isn't my own and never has been. And insofar as I think my life is my own, I will suffer. The practice of kindness is best expressed in the practice of the 6 paramitas: generosity, ethical conduct, energy, patience, meditation, and wisdom. The wisdom that sees how everything is empty of any separation, as we've already discussed. These 6 practices and the various teachings that go with them are fundamental to Zen. Ultimately, they lead to the understanding that we are all living and dying together. There is no other way to live but to feel for one another and to do what we can to help, and the ways we can help are unlimited. Finally, Zen is Buddhism, and there is no Buddhism without the 4 Noble Truths. First, all conditioned existence is suffering, dukkha, fundamentally unsatisfactory, off balance. Second, there is a cause of this suffering, misknowledge, our projecting a world that isn't real and then clinging to that false world. Third, there is an end to this suffering. By understanding my life and living my understanding, I can undo the cause of suffering and experience even my tragedies and misfortunes as non-suffering. And fourth, there is a path called the Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, and right concentration. In Zen, the Eightfold Path is generally expressed as Zazen and precepts practice. If I were to answer your question another day, I might well come up with a different list of most important teachings, but this is my list for today. Susan, why does Zen seem to go out of its way not to make sense? Norman, Actually, I don't think Zen doesn't make sense. But it makes sense different from our usual way of making sense. The usual way is to assume that our descriptions of our lives are accurate, that the way we conceive of things is the way they actually are. This is an unfounded assumption. Mostly we don't have an accurate view of our lives. And yet our lives go on day by day, despite our faulty conception of them. It follows then that a teaching, Zen, that proposes a more accurate description of our lives would seem to us not to make sense, at least at first, but that later, since this description actually is more accurate, it would begin to make sense once we get used to it. This has been my experience and that of most Zen students. At first, the teachings might seem odd or nonsensical, in brackets, though also at the same time intriguing, because you sense that there is something to them. But after you have practiced and studied for a while, they do make sense, and you can discuss and think about them reasonably. Our lives include many paradoxical and contradictory elements. Things are usually not just one way. There are many ways at once. To begin with, we are definitely alive, yet at the same time we are dying. Every moment is a moment of life, and at the same time, a moment of death is there in each moment, even as it arises, completely gone, never to reappear. Excuse me, I have to repeat this sentence. Every moment is a moment of life, and at the same time a moment of death, in that each moment is gone, even as it arises, completely gone, never to reappear. In our usual conception of our lives, we are alive now and dead later, but this isn't really the case. Zen discourse fully recognizes and embraces this and the many other paradoxes, contradictions, and conundrums that actually do make up a true conception of our lives, and this is why Zen seems at first to willfully not make sense. But to back up a bit, Zen is basically a Chinese expression of original Buddhism. And no one accuses Buddhism of not making sense. Buddhism makes perfect sense. It is logical, it leads from point A to point B, from the noble truth of suffering to the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the path. You may or may not agree with this analysis of human life, but it certainly makes sense. Original Buddhism is expressed in the Sanskrit and Pali languages, which have the same Indo-European root our languages have. So its style of communication is congenial for us. These languages, like ours, are inflected, the verbs have tenses, there are parts of speech with signs to identify them, and so on. Chinese, however, doesn't make sense to us. It has no tenses. It has no parts of speech. It has no alphabet either, only pictographs. A completely different system of writing that includes immense suggestibility, nuance, and paradox. Much depends on context, but very little straight line clarity and logic. This means that Chinese thinking and the Chinese literary tradition were quite differently than ours. This is still true today. Recently, a Chinese scholar was translating a few of my poems into Chinese. He had a long list of questions for me about the poems, questions that never would have come up if he were translating into German or French. I could barely see the point of the questions and found them extremely difficult to answer. So when Buddhism was transmitted to China, The Chinese had a lot of trouble understanding this strange foreign religion that came from a language and a set of linguistic and cultural assumptions that were utterly different from their own. It took the Chinese several hundred years to digest Buddhism and to properly translate it into their own idiom. In the process, they created, naturally and inevitably, something quite different in expression from what they had received. My imagination of it is that once the Chinese sages really appreciated the Buddhist teachings, they thought they were a little funny. That is, the utter seriousness, piety, and linear logic of the scriptures must have struck them as funny. So when Chinese Buddhists began producing their own religious literature, Zen literature, they emphasized this fun. They used slang, jokes, references to poetry and legends, and they emphasized and delighted in the sense of paradox they found in the Mahayana teachings. They were themselves already Zen-like in their embrace of paradox and contradiction. So yes, paradox and an odd use of language are features of Zen literature. This may make it seem hard to understand, but once you get used to it, it is easier to appreciate. Susan: But Norman, isn't Zen a philosophical, spiritual stance that goes far beyond language structures? Norman: Yes, you're right. There is something else operating in Zen literature that has to do with the very nature of language itself. One view is that Zen is beyond language, that it is pointing to something, maybe an experience or sense of life, that can never be indicated in any way in language. According to this view, Zen denigrates all language as superficial and inherently un-Zen. Subscribing to this view, you would throw out all I have said above and simply assert, yes, Zen language makes no sense, because it wants to destroy your idea of language and sense. The mind-blowing you referred to earlier. As I've been saying, I don't subscribe to this view. My thoughts about Zen and language come from Dogen's writings. Dogen argued that language isn't inherently superficial. It can be useful for our living and our deep spiritual insights, provided we know how to situate ourselves within it, not merely seizing on the one-dimensional meaning of words and thinking we understand reality based on that linear meaning. To understand a Zen text may require more than just knowing what the words mean. It may require that you be able to see, feel, and live the meaning beyond the words, that you not be stuck on the words themselves, but see that the experience of words actually goes beyond words. To some extent, the apparent opacity of Zen texts has to do with this. The intention of the text is not to be understood in the usual sense, to grasp ideas, but rather to be felt, lived, and digested. Since our sense of a text and what a text is supposed to do doesn't include this notion, we sometimes find Zen texts a little frustrating to read. But they are not meant to be read in the usual way. They are meant to be meditated on, contemplated, chewed on. This idea of text, by the way, is similar to some contemporary notions, and much has been written comparing Dogen's view of language to that of important Western philosophers, notably Wittgenstein and Heidegger. Not incidentally, my theory and practice of poetry also come from this view of language. So for today, this is what I wanted to bring in. you will hear me again with the chapter Stages of Practice on next Saturday. If you hear it now, I think we have met now chapter 7. We have gone back a little bit to put it in a gap that seemed to be there between chapter 6 and chapter 8. And I wish to thank you wholeheartedly, Norman Roshi and Susan Sensei, that they appreciate this. I hope. I mean, they consented to that we do this practice of book reading, and you might go to the page www.everydayzen.org, and which I mentioned before, and just enjoy the huge list of teachings and of podcasts and everything Norman has mentioned before. So, thank you for your attentiveness. And may this reading and studying and sharing touch all beings with our love.